The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Can Science Disprove Gods? So I tend to get a lot of email with people asking me questions about, hey, I've heard this argument or that argument, and I've got this way of dealing with it. Is it good? Is it bad? You know, or is there a better way? What can I do? On other occasions, someone will email and say, hey, I'm going to be doing a debate, and here's the topic and the format, and can you give me some thoughts on this? And that's great. I mean, that's one of the reasons I do the Atheist Debates Project in the first place. Not every debate is going to be a big formal debate with structure and timed conversations. Some of them are just going to be sitting around with people having the discussions, and we need to be able to do all of that. But recently someone emailed me and said, I managed to score my first public debate, and the only topic that this person would agree to is, can science disprove God? And immediately I wrote back, I was on my phone, and said, I can't begin to express just how bad this topic is. You realize you don't have to agree to a debate. You don't have to agree to a format or a question or a topic that isn't conducive to a good discussion. If it seems to be something that's going to shift the burden of proof, you don't have to accept it. It's better sometimes to not have a bad debate than to go ahead and engage and risk. Now, I'm not just talking about mistakes. Mistakes are going to be made. We've all made mistakes. I've made mistakes. It's one of the reasons why I go back and do the walkthroughs through the debates I've done in the past, so that we can learn from the mistakes I made and mistakes my opponents have made. There is a way to try to make the best of this. And so I sat down and I thought, you know, if I were stuck defending the proposition, can science, or that science can in fact disprove God, how would I deal with it? How can we turn a potentially losing proposition into a productive debate? Let's take a look. So somehow or another you found yourself saddled with what is a terrible debate topic. Can science disprove God? And it's problematic for a number of reasons. If it's not handled correctly, it can look like we don't understand the burden of proof, we don't understand skepticism, we don't understand science, maybe we don't even understand the process of debating. And so all of these things need to be addressed to try to salvage this. And I think we can actually do more than salvage it. I think there's a way to make this topic go from terrible to productive. And there's a handful of things that we have to address in the course of doing this debate. The first thing is you have to actually address the topic. The individual I was talking to was going to kind of completely dodge the topic and do some kind of trick thing where, oh, well, I never said science can disprove God. That's what you've pretty much agreed to do. You've agreed to take up the affirmative position on a debate, the question being, can science disprove God? So you have to treat the topic, and you have to treat it honestly and thoroughly. One of the reasons this topic's so bad is that it's not particularly well defined. It has one very specific connotation within the scientific community. It has another connotation within the minds of the people who hear this, the way we think about things, the way we casually and colloquially talk about, oh, this is proved or this is disproved. So you've also got to start by defining what each of the words mean. What do we mean by science? What do we mean by disproved? And what do we mean by God? Because science can't disprove any ill-defined notion. You could get into the subject of falsifiability, and I'd definitely recommend that. But if the thing that is being offered isn't sufficiently defined that science can investigate it, then we're stuck. And so we need to know, what exactly is this concept, God concept that we're addressing? Is this something that we can investigate? Is this proposition falsifiable? Because if it's not falsifiable, then it falls outside the purview of science. It falls outside the purview of skepticism and critical thinking to the extent that we can confirm or disconfirm something. But science also doesn't disprove anything, really, ever. Science is about building models and theories that are testable, predictive, falsifiable assessments of what we observe in reality. They are tentative conclusions about observations, and they are the tentative conclusions that best fit the evidence. We have no observations about a God or anything else supernatural. And so we can't reasonably use that as an explanation for things. Now, in a previous video, I talked about the supernatural existence, the problem of being able to identify this at all, let alone getting down to supernatural causation. And this is going to be a problem here as well, because this topic is kind of a standard attempt to shift the burden of proof. The individuals who are offering forth this idea that some God exists have a burden of proof. And the topic, has science disproved God, is kind of setting up a hidden argument from ignorance, that it's somehow reasonable to accept that a God exists until such time as we have disproved it. And that is exactly the opposite of the way things should be. And so that needs to be addressed during the debate as well. This idea that we should believe things until they're disproved obviously leads to us being forced, if we're intellectually honest, to accept mutually exclusive ideas. If we're going to believe everything until it's disproved, you're going to find yourself believing things that are in contradiction. And so the reasonable position is not to believe anything until it has been well established, until it has been proved in a colloquial sense. And that's a point that actually needs to be stressed, because if this idea that people have that somehow it's reasonable to believe that a God exists until such time as it's been disproved resonates with them, then we have to make them aware that there are other God concepts and other propositions about God and gods that also may not be in a position that they could be disproved. And if they're going to be intellectually honest, they would have to believe all of them. And yet they only believe the one, which means that they must then provide some other mechanism. Mere scientific disproof or failure to disprove can't be the criteria by which they establish what is reasonable, what's believable. So they have to have some other criteria. And this is a point that we need to address during the debate to make sure that we're not just being shifted off into a side discussion about what science can or can't disprove, but we also need to fairly address what they can in fact prove. Because at a minimum, we'd be sitting in a position where we're stuck, where we have no idea what to believe. Science, or more accurately, logical reasoning, can in fact disprove in a colloquial sense some gods and some God propositions, provided that they either entail some internal inconsistency in their qualities or some inconsistency with what we observe in the real world. For example, if you had a God concept that included God created the earth and the earth is the only planet, then the observation of other planets would present a contradiction such that we know that particular God model isn't true. That God may exist and we may have bad information about it. There could be any number of other ways around this problem. But the entire God concept package of a God who created the earth and it is the only planet is refuted by the observation of other planets. And therefore, that particular God in its entirety cannot exist. So I typed up that list of concerns and ideas and thoughts about this particular topic, the types of things we'd need to address to potentially turn what would easily be viewed as a losing topic, a losing debate, into something that is at least a productive debate. And then I wrote up what I think is a pretty good opening statement, a good way to work these things together and address them. And I'll go ahead and read that opening statement in just a couple of minutes. But I wanted to point out that unless you're in a formal, scored debate, in which case, hopefully, if you're on a debate team and you're getting ready to go in and have a properly scored competition debate, I don't know that you would necessarily accept this proposition or accept this position on the question, on the issue at hand, and I doubt that you'd necessarily get much out of what I'm about to say. But almost nobody is in that situation. And so some things to remember is that you're not required to debate anybody. You can turn things down. And even if you find yourself having this particular discussion about science proving or disproving God in a more conversational sense or any other topic, you're allowed to say, I don't know, it's a good thing. You're also allowed to say, I don't think this question's phrased properly. I think we are perhaps shifting the burden of proof. Shouldn't we be talking about what you can demonstrate? What is your claim? But there's an important thing to remember when having these conversations and when arguing in front of a crowd who believe the opposite of what you believe. From a rational point of view, if we just consider the proposition, they may in fact have the burden of proof. But they already accept this. It's in their head. And from their point of view, you have a very significant burden of proof to change their mind. And the way to make this clear, to acknowledge this, you're up there presenting your case, you don't agree with them, and you need to demonstrate why. And if you hope to change their mind, that is a burden of proof that you have to adopt. But it's important to be very clear about which burden of proof you're actually adopting. If, for example, they say, I believe that a God exists, your burden of proof is not to prove that gods don't exist. The objection here is that they don't seem to have a rational, evidence-based foundation for that position. So your burden of proof is to show that their reasons for believing aren't rational. Not that what they believe is actually false. It is silly and it's a huge mistake to get up and try to disprove that gods in general don't exist, or that their God in particular doesn't exist, unless we're able to identify one of those contradictions that I spoke about earlier. And when I'm talking with believers, my position is not, you are in fact wrong. It's, I don't believe that you're right. You haven't made your case. And what I'd like to convince you of is that you don't have good reasons for believing in the way you think you do. And that's why we, on the show, ask people, tell me what you believe and why. I understand you believe in the God of the Bible, but why? And if they present their reasons and you show the flaws in the reasoning each time, that is you meeting the burden of proof for why you think that they aren't justified in accepting this. You don't ever have to adopt the position, and in fact it may be a mistake, not in all cases, but it may be a mistake to try to adopt the position that I'm going to prove that what you believe is actually false, rather than I'm going to demonstrate that you don't have good reasons for thinking that it's true. But here's the opening that I put together, and I apologize for just kind of reading to the camera, but I think it kind of pieces together the ideas I was talking about in a way that might turn a losing proposition or the losing side of a debate under one understanding into something that might actually be winnable. And at a minimum, something that I think communicates important ideas and teaches people something about the burden of proof, the nature of evidence, what we can and can't disprove, and how and where it's relevant. Thank you all for attending. I'm grateful to be here tonight, though I have a bit of a confession to make, and that's a standard, straightforward reading of tonight's topic, Can Science Disprove God?, can probably only result in one answer: no. Now, before anyone gets out of their chairs thinking that I've conceded the entire debate, I'd like to point out that what we tend to mean when we utter the words, can science disprove God, may not be so standardized or so straightforward. I wasn't thrilled to have this topic for this very reason, but it does present an opportunity to talk about this topic and see if we're able to both find a yes and educate folks in the process. So what do we mean when we ask the question, can science disprove God? It may be that my opponent and I mean very different things. After all, one could argue that science doesn't disprove anything, ever. Science is focused on confirming proposed models and developing theories that describe observations about the universe. Science doesn't make proclamations about truth and doesn't deal in absolute certainty. So if my opponent begins to demand absolute certainty with respect to anything, but especially this unscientific notion of disproof, he's setting a bar that virtually no scientist or philosopher would ever support, and it's merely a tactic to avoid the undeniable fact that science deals in probabilities and leads to tentative conclusions that best fit the evidence. So if science doesn't actually disprove anything, then we're done, right? I mean, twice now I've basically said the answer has to be no. Well, not quite, because what we tend to mean colloquially when we talk about proof and disproof, and when we speak about science disproving a proposition, is actually just a statement that the proposition is ill-defined, is untestable, lacks good supporting evidence, or even has some evidence against it. It may mean that we have no good reason to believe that the proposition is true, or it may be that we have good reasons to believe that it is in fact not true. When we're looking at the terms, it strikes me that we really need a strong definition of God in order to begin, because it's entirely possible to logically disprove a God whose definition entails either an internal contradiction, a God that both exists and does not exist, or one whose definition conflicts with observations about the universe, observations that we have about reality, observations that are supported by strong evidence. My God created the universe, which only contains the planet Earth and a sun. The evidence for the other planets and stars and galaxies alone demonstrate to the highest degree possible that this God doesn't exist. And while a scientific explanation along those lines would still be tentative and probabilistic, we have at a minimum a logical contradiction that would qualify as some sort of disproof for that God. So once my opponent gives a thorough or adequate definition of God, then we can begin to investigate and see, first of all, is there any supporting evidence for that God? If not, then we haven't disproved it, but they also haven't proved it or made any attempt to do so or even demonstrated that there's a concept there worthy of consideration. And until they do, there can't be sufficient reason for belief, because we can't investigate something without knowing what it is that we're seeking, or some minimal definition of what it is we're looking for. We can also ask whether the definition of God contains any internal contradictions. Some versions of classical theistic gods with the attributes of omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, those can result in internal contradictions depending on how they're defined, and that's why the definitions are so important. We can also look for, does this definition conflict with observations about the natural world? If either of those cases is true, then that God has been disproved in about the only possible sense. Throughout history, gods have been proposed and redefined. They've been invented as explanations for the unknown or to quell our fears. We know this. I'd suspect that my opponent agrees with this point, because there are many, many gods that he clearly doesn't believe in, which means he's ruled those other gods to be fictions and determined that his is fact. But how did those proposed gods lose their followers? They were defined in such a way that it simply became unreasonable to continue believing in them in the face of better scientific explanations for the universe that seemed to conflict with what those God propositions had to say about the universe. They also stood in the face of gods who were defined less rigidly. It turns out that the less rigid your definition of God is, the harder it is to pin down. But that also has the drawback of making it probably unfalsifiable, something that we may not be able to examine scientifically or rigorously. And therefore, while you could say, you can't disprove this, that becomes largely irrelevant, because there's all kinds of things that you can't disprove. You see, if you define a vague God that cannot be investigated scientifically, it's much harder and perhaps impossible to disprove that God. Thor used to be the god of thunder, hurling lightning bolts from the sky. But when we discovered that lightning was a natural phenomenon, an electrostatic discharge, Thor became less believable. Did we disprove Thor? Not in any absolute sense. I suppose some could propose that Thor does control the lightning, and our discovery that it's just a natural phenomenon doesn't disprove Thor's existence, it just shows us how Thor throws lightning. After all, this is precisely what some Christians have done with respect to scientific conflicts with their worldview. When it was exposed that the claims of Genesis weren't literally correct, they became more metaphoric. When evolution became virtually undeniable to all but the most anti-scientific, some Christians simply acknowledge the fact that evolution merely describes how God went about creating the diverse set of species. Although this doesn't explain why some of them actually believe in the ridiculously unscientific super rapid evolution that is required if all species on the planet were repopulated by the contents of one 600-year-old man's boat, it's at least something that they can put forward. But does that prove the case, or is their God just getting smaller and more vague in the face of better competing explanations of the universe? The truth is that the proposition of tonight's debate, can science disprove God, is an attempt to shift the burden of proof. It's an attempt to reframe the entire discussion in such a way that the God proposition appears reasonable until someone disproves it. It's a way for theists to avoid defending the proposition that they actually believe. namely that a God exists, or that it's reasonable to believe in God until such time as it's disproved. But this is an entirely unreasonable position, because while my opponent may have some God that he defines, which science can't disprove under very narrow and unscientific definitions of science and disprove, there are other gods that one could define which science could also not disprove under those conditions. And that means that mere disproof by science is irrelevant. My opponent must have some other way to distinguish between the various gods that science can't disprove, or else he's guilty of special pleading. If there are 12 God propositions that can't be disproved by science, and he's managed to pick one of them while rejecting the other one, that's either a fallacy of special pleading, or he has some reliable mechanism by which he's able to discern which of them is fact and which is fiction. And that needs to be presented in the course of demonstrating the truth of his proposition. If he has a God that he thinks can't be disproved by science, that would be true for other gods as well. How does he decide between them? If he thinks that science can disprove those other gods, then he's the one claiming that science can disprove God. And my position in this debate of science being able to disprove at least some God propositions is already settled. But when he says science can disprove God, but not my God, that's where the fallacy of special pleading comes in, and that's where the admission that there's something about his God that prevents science from examining it, even if science can examine other God claims. And what if that something is that it's not well defined, that it's not falsifiable, that it's not the sort of proposition that science can confirm or rebuke at this point? If we both agree that science cannot disprove gods, then we're done. And his God is on even footing with all the others. Not disproved, but also not proved, which means that no one can be reasonably justified in believing in a God until someone meets the burden of proof for that God, which would first require meeting a burden of proof to demonstrate a mechanism for identifying supernatural causation, which would either qualify as science or as some new way of knowing, which would have to be verified scientifically. If we both agree that science can disprove gods, but he wants to exclude his God, then he's adopted a new burden of proof. He not only needs to prove that his God exists, he has to prove that only his God can be proved to exist. In the first case, the attempt to avoid a burden of proof actually results in several new burdens of proof, possibly including one for an entirely new way of knowing. In the second, the attempt to avoid a burden of proof results in two new burdens of proof. There's a reason that science is based on methodological naturalism, essentially the recognition that we are currently and perhaps forever blocked from confirming the supernatural. There's a reason why courtrooms, at least in this country, adopt the innocent until proven guilty standard. If you fail to convict someone, you haven't proven that they're innocent. That's the default assumption. You failed to prove guilt. There's a reason why the time to believe any claim is after it's been demonstrated reasonable to do so. You see, you have two options. Either you believe every claim until it's disproved, or you believe no claim until it is proved. And if you believe every claim, you'll be forced to believe contradictory claims and have no mechanism to reconcile that conflict. That's a state of cognitive dissonance, and it results in an irrational worldview that leads to madness, which is why we encourage the other option. Believe only after proper supporting evidence is presented, and don't be fooled by the attempts to avoid presenting evidence that invariably take the "you can't prove God doesn't exist" line that we frequently hear. Can science disprove God? Yes and no, depending on definitions. I wonder which position my opponent actually holds, because as I explained earlier, his God doesn't fare well under either model. So that's roughly what I came up with as a potential opening for the debate. Now, there's more you could include, and you could remove some elements, but you need to set this up so that you are talking about the topic and you are acknowledging that we need to define terms and we need to explore this, but that they may in fact be wrong about the nature of science and disproof, and that there may be some misunderstandings about the burden of proof or even an attempt to shift it. But a debate isn't just an opening statement, and if you're doing this conversationally, it's probably more important to have some questions, to ask them. Now, one key thing about questions, my goal with the project is not to give people a list of things to do. Here's things to say. We don't want people operating off a script. We want people to have actually thought about these topics and actually understand them. The goal is to expose that the other side may be operating from a script, or that they may not understand it, or to find out whether or not they actually know something that we don't, and to learn from it. So some potential questions to ask during this discussion, and these are questions that you should think about ahead of time and try to imagine the different answers that you're going to get and how you might respond to them. And if you find yourself stuck, if you can't imagine what kind of response they could give, ask people. It's okay to engage in stuff, and find yourself a theist friend or a message board and say, you know, in this subject of, you know, science disproving God, if I were to ask you to define your God, what kind of answer would you give me? You know, how do you define God? I mean, it's not enough to just say, oh, the God of the Bible, because there's 1,000 or more different Christian denominations that are all pointing to the God of the Bible. And then if you only reference the Old Testament, you've got Judaism as well. I need something a little bit more. I need something about the characteristics of that God. Other questions to ask. Is he using, or is your opponent using, different standards of disprove for his God and other gods? If they're convinced that science has in any way disproved of those other gods but can't disprove theirs, are they equivocating on the term disprove? You know, is this special pleading, or is this an equivocation where they're using it in an entirely different context that they might even recognize? How did they go about disregarding those other gods? You know, was it science? If it was personal revelation, for example, they need to acknowledge that personal revelation is not good for anybody else. Your personal revelation does me no good. It does your neighbor no good. I'm fully willing to believe that you may be honest and may be convinced that you've received this personal revelation, but that's a separate issue from whether or not what you think you received is actually true. If you're basing it on the Bible, then we need to have a discussion about why you consider the Bible valid. How did you go about rejecting these other books? Why is it that you find this book compelling? And part of that comes down to, why isn't this God obvious to everyone? I mean, either God exists or it doesn't. That's the simple solution. And if God does exist, then it either manifests in reality in some detectable way, or it doesn't. If it doesn't, we're done. But if it does manifest in reality in a detectable way, which is kind of the position we're in, because Christians and other theists are running around pretty much claiming to be little God detectors. He helped me find my car keys. He cured my cancer. He's manifesting in reality in all sorts of ways that they're able to detect. So this would make it a testable proposition, or at least something that we can examine. If he thinks that science confirms his God, then what about the wrong order of creation, the flood, the Tower of Babel? They may disregard all those things as metaphoric. This is why you have to drill down to get the best definition of what it is that they're actually talking about that you possibly can. Do they think that science can disprove other gods? Do they even understand the way science works? Do they realize that what science does is not make proclamations about truth, but actually comes up with probabilistic models of the world that are the best explanations for the current observations? This sounds a lot like the last one, but it's different. This idea of whether or not you can scientifically disprove gods. Your opponent needs to describe the model, how it works, and how he knows it works, and how he was able to determine that this was a reliable model if it's not scientific. They believe in some God, some package of ideas, and they're convinced that this is true. You know, many of them would bet their lives on it and swear up and down, and some of them will even acknowledge that there's nothing you could say that would ever change their mind. So what was the mechanism that confirmed the model? You know, did they confirm that God exists by science, or did they use some other thing? This way, if you get into appeals to faith, personal revelation, gut feelings, oh, the contradictory is absurd. This has to be the case because it's absurd to think that it couldn't be the case. Those are all claims at the foundation of their beliefs that they would then need to demonstrate. There's a lot more to actually talk about on this subject and a lot of other subjects, but I put together some thoughts on a potential closing to this debate. And since I've already noted that it's worthwhile to remember that you're talking to people who believe something And so even though they should have the burden of proof, you at least have a burden of proof to show why you don't believe and why you think they shouldn't believe. But I put together a couple notes on a closing remark for this debate. I have no idea if he ended up using it or not, but I think that it might actually be a bit snarky to some. But if you're in a position where the only debate that they've agreed to is to shift the burden of proof, maybe this is justified. As noted, my opponent simply wouldn't debate any other topic. Why not? 1 Peter 3:15 requires Christians to be ready at all times to give the reason for their faith. It doesn't instruct them to be ready at all times to shift the burden of proof and expect others to prove God doesn't exist. Some Christian debate opponents argue on behalf of vague first cause prime mover gods, which are entirely deistic, and they don't even begin to approach any sort of defense of the purportedly risen Savior that they claim to believe in. I doubt that the Great Commission intended Christians to go out and convince people that there was a vague first cause or prime mover. If they can't or won't defend what they actually believe, that's kind of bad. But when they also try to imply that we're somehow justified in believing the full breadth of their version of Christianity merely because they managed to convince an atheist to defend the anemic and confused proposition that science can disprove God, I'd say that speaks volumes. But at the end of the day, whether or not science can or has disproved a particular God is the wrong question. A failure to disprove anything does not mean that the contrary is actually proved. Where's the evidence that what he actually believes is true? It's confusing to me and befuddling, I guess, that we've been debating these topics for thousands of years. I don't understand why God isn't plainly obvious to everybody. Why is a Damascus Road experience good enough for Saul, but the rest of us, you need to become experts in dead languages and read books and study things that aren't even in the scriptures, and then try and figure out which of the things that isn't in the scriptures probably should be or is the correct interpretation. Oh, no, you don't have to do any of that, Matt. You just have to be humble in your heart and pray and seek God, and God will reveal himself to you. And yet I've done so, and so have others. Oh, no, you haven't done that. There's something wrong with you. And so if they're not going to actually offer a defense of the God they believe in, their last resort is to push the blame off to you. If you sought God and God didn't answer, it's your fault. There was a failing on your end. He might have helped Billy Bob, who doesn't understand the first thing about theology, find his keys and get off the booze, but somebody who spent years in sincere prayer and study, whose only goal was to become the best Christian that he could be, nothing. But that's your fault. This is a win-win proposition for their God. It's the same as when you talk about answered prayer. Hey, God, do this, please, I'm begging you. And the answer is yes, no, or not right now. Well, yeah, those are the available answers. And if it continually comes up no and not right now to any reasonable observer, then what we need are what we're asking for are some examples of some clear yeses that you can tie back to the proposition. Because if it happens at the rate of chance or worse, I'm not sure that you have any good reason to even point to prayer. I'm not sure your proposition has a prayer. This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.